Coming up, still no stopping the political power parade through our bi-state, plus an acquittal in the Schlitterbahn tragedy. We track the fight over birth certificates in Kansas. And as New York City reports its first weekend without a shooting in decades, we're now named 5th most violent city in America.
Week in Review is made possible through the generous support of Dave and Jamie Cummings, Bob and Marlise Gorley, Smithfield Foods, Haas and Wilkerson Insurance, the Courtney S. Turner Charitable Trust, John H. Mize and Bank of America N.A. co-trustees, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome everyone, I'm Nick Haynes, and fasten your seatbelt for a whirlwind tour through the most impactful and important local stories of the week with Mr. Up-to-Date on KCUR, star editorial writer Steve Kraske. From the Fox 4 Morning News team, news anchor Mark Alford, the senior writer for the Call newspaper Eric Wesson, and political analyst, columnist, and Kansas City Star editorialist Dave Helling. The cavalcade of big political names parachuting into our bi-state continues this week. Vice President Mike Pence spending not 1 but 2 days in Kansas, including a fundraiser for Chris Kobach in Wichita. Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao on a tour of the 3rd District with Kansas Congressman Kevin Yoder. And Speaker of the House Paul Ryan heading to town, joining Yoder at a private event in Mission Hills on Tuesday. Add to all of this, 2 of the nation's news anchors hosting their newscasts in Kansas City over the last few days. Okay, let's start with the politicians. We've headlined this program 3 weeks in a row with presidential and vice presidential visits. Is there really anything new to say or report on this trend of intense laser beam focus on our bi-state, Steve?
You know, I don't think so, but you certainly get the impression that when these dignitaries fly into a state, that's usually a sign that the candidates they're trying to back need some help, need a boost both financially and from a popularity standpoint. So you do get a sense that, you know, as we all know, the governor's race in Kansas, very close. Mike Pence helping out there. Kevin Yoder in a very tough race against Sharice Davids, getting some help as well.
How is it, though, by the way, that we have hundreds of issues and problems in this country? The Missouri U.S. Senate race now seems to be so completely about one thing. More questions were asked about it at this week's big debate than anything else. I'm talking about pre-existing conditions. Have you seen the ads?
Earlier this year, we learned our oldest has a rare chronic disease, pre-existing condition.
Josh Hawley filed a lawsuit letting insurance companies deny coverage for those with pre-existing conditions.
I support forcing insurance companies to cover all pre-existing conditions, and Claire McCaskill knows it.
Josh Hawley, he's lying right to our faces.
All right. Is it that no one cares about any other issue anymore, or is it simply that the consultants tell the candidates that's what's going to resonate with voters, Eric?
Right, because Josh Hawley, since he's really relatively new to politics, he doesn't have a record to run on or for her to attack. So it's easier to deal with the pre-existing conditions. And since a large majority of the state of Missouri are elderly people or people that are on some type of medical insurance, that's his Achilles heel. Her consultants are telling her.
It's interesting, though, I mean, with all of the issues we have, that it's coming down to that as the most, the biggest issue in that race.
Well, Nick, I think you're seeing this nationwide, though. The Russia meddling probe is going to come to fruition, the investigation by Mueller after the midterms, it looks like. So Democrats nationwide have really glommed onto this issue. It's historical, it's emotional, everyone has a feeling on it. And it's really casting the haves against the have-nots, which the Democrats have been very successful in trying to get the have-nots into their camp and get their vote.
Dave.
Yeah, I think Mark is right. The Democrats, broadly speaking, have won this argument because it's dominated the discussion. Not on the merits necessarily, but the Democrats would much rather play on health care than they would on something else. Tax cuts, for example, which many Republicans thought would be their winning issue. You hear virtually nothing about the Trump tax cuts in this campaign. So broadly speaking, as a tactical matter, it's a win for Democrats, and I think that's why you're seeing so much focus on it.
You know, Nick, Democrats for years now have been on the defensive when it comes to the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare. Suddenly they can go on the offense on this issue with good reason, because as we sit here today, I think it's fair to say that Republicans still have had trouble coming up with an alternative. They have struggled with that from the get-go when it comes to this issue, and they still are.
The CBS Evening News came live from Kansas City this week and included interviews with Claire McCaskill and Josh Hawley. The NBC Nightly News was also just in town, broadcasting live from the deck of the Liberty Memorial with the skyline of Kansas City as its backdrop. That broadcast, though, had a different theme, the country's economic divide. Lester Holt picked Kansas City's dividing line, Troost Avenue, as a story with lessons for the nation.
People treat Troost Avenue like it's the demarcation line in a war zone. They won't go across it.
Karen Slaughter has lived east of Troost most of her life. As a child, she wouldn't cross the street. But today, as the president of her neighborhood association, she is pushing for change.
We were a food desert from approximately 2009 to June of this year.
Now, thanks to her team, a supermarket, incentivized by the city to move in, is thriving. And on Troost Avenue, change is in the air.
So we'll do like a stainless steel top on the fridge.
Right.
Chef Justin and Rashawn Clark opened the Urban Cafe on Troost when everyone said they shouldn't.
What did people say when you said, I'm going to open up a restaurant right on Troost? Oh, man, they thought I was crazy.
Their original place so successful, they're building one 3 times as big, still on Troost Avenue.
For all the negative headlines about the Troost divide, was it an accurate portrayal of how things are changing on Troost Avenue, Eric?
Slowly but surely, it is changing to a degree. It's still the subtle racism or the subtle divide there, but it is changing a little bit. That's a good example that they used in talking to those young people that have the restaurants there, but it's still the same. It's the psychological thing that people know that it's there.
Mark.
I see it in real estate as well, and if you look at the investment east of Troost versus west of Troost, it's becoming less divisive. It's moving over towards the 71 highway line. But now the control is on gentrification. People going in, investors, especially from out of town. Kansas City is really pitched as a hot real estate market. Investors going in, fixing up the properties, making them more valuable, and the people who are there now can no longer afford to live there. That's the issue.
You know, Eric is right. Troost has not been transformed. But I think it would be a mistake to let this moment go without just noting this is a moment. This is a moment for our community psychologically. Troost has had such a black mark attached to it for so many years as we talk about race, in this community. And suddenly, Troost is getting a little bit of a different hue here as we move forward. It's an important moment for our community.
But I get lots of letters here, and including one right here, from viewers who are, dismayed by the lack of investment on the east side, east of Troost. Let's start with some of those right now. We have one viewer, Anna, who wants to know if the city wants to be seen as not abandoning the east side, why are they so unwilling to fund a new plan to invest $10 million at 18th and Vine? That just came up.
Well, first of all, that's in its initial stages. The city just spent $7 million on 18th and Vine. And this new proposal is under discussion, although we should note for the record that the idea of using the 8-cent East Side sales tax, the Central City tax, has been taken off the table by Jermaine Reed, who's proposing it. And by the way, not everyone on the East Side thinks $10 million should go to 18th and Vine. There are other areas, particularly along Prospect, that they believe needs more attention. So there is not unanimity in the minority community or the East Side community of where this money needs to go. But all the discussion here is important, Nick, because if you can fix Troost, and it's very fragile, but if you can fix Troost, you can fix Prospect. And if you can fix Prospect and Troost, you can bring a rebirth to the east side. That's the vision. That's a reachable vision if this fragile recovery can be maintained.
So now the question is whether the money moves from Troost to Paseo or it goes Prospect or it goes down 18th Street. One of the biggest things that we have in the black community is, behind the scenes discussion is the 8-cent sales tax is supposed to help with the development along the Prospect corridor. So the argument was now you're going to take that money and use it toward the infrastructure when it's earmarked supposedly for the Prospect corridor. So the argument is where that money is going to go, and people are like, like, okay, we've put money into 18th and Vine, we've paid for this, and it's still not developed. We still have really nothing down there. So the argument is, where do we best put this money? And now Scott Taylor has the East Side Development Plan, per se, with another $14 million investment. Where are you going to get this $14 million if you can't get 7 and 10 to finish 18th Street?
Very quickly, Nick, there is no question that there is a momentum to spend more money on the east side of Kansas City, east of Troost. But there is great disagreement about how to spend that money and where and how much. Until those questions are resolved, primarily among African-American leaders on the east side, it will be harder to find ways to spend that money. And I think we're at a critical juncture in that discussion, and it needs to be addressed.
Let me just say one more thing. Housing, because you still have the affordable housing issue on the east side and housing at all. So you do development, you do housing, or do you do housing and not
There's no consensus on any of it.
Yeah. KCPT viewer Byron wanted to know what happened to those plans to name the airport or a street after Dr. Martin Luther King. That was going to be the Paseo, wasn't it, Eric? What happened?
The will of the people was to do the airport. So now I talked to Quentin Lucas yesterday, and he had put it in the East Side plan, but I guess evidently they're going to pull it out. But I think it's died by the wayside as well. When the conversation shifted from the airport to a terminal, from Paseo to the airport, I think people have just said, what the heck, and moved on to something else.
This was the handwritten letter I received from Arthur Robinson. He writes, what about the condition of the streets east of Troost? The city paves part or all of Ward Parkway every year. Prospect from 75th to 77th Street has 2 potholes that are 6 foot wide. Indiana from 43rd Street to Benton Boulevard is undrivable. I've complained to 311 several times, got no response. Can you please talk about this in one of your segments? Thank you, Arthur. Is there a divide there?
Yes, absolutely, because that's supposed to be the GO bond money was supposed to repair the streets. And it's like, okay, sidewalks, the roads, and some of that money is going up north, and people are like, okay, when is it going to come down into the urban core? Because some of the streets are ridiculous. It's like, it feels like the bottom of your car is going to fall out.
Although I did drive Warnell yesterday from 79th South to 435, and it is a mess. I mean, it's like you're going back in the 1800s.
Right. You know, crime wasn't the focus of either of the national broadcasts that we just saw coming from Kansas City, even though we've just passed a depressing milestone, now more than 100 murders in Kansas City this year. In fact, 108 homicides as we tape this program, making Kansas City the 5th most violent big city in America, according to the FBI Crime Data Report. And Mark Alford, Fox 4, profiling a Kansas City funeral director this week who says he's now refusing to accept any more business from the families of murder victims because the scale of violent death is now so large it's impacting his mental health.
That's right. His name is Malcolm Morris. He's 54, I believe. So far this year, he has serviced 20 families, murder victims, 4 to 23 years of age, and pretty much all black males. And he is just so emotionally impacted by this. He was going home and drinking heavily, and he said, I am not taking this on emotionally anymore unless it's someone I specifically know. We are not going to service the families.
There was also an editorial in the Star this week talking about Kansas City, Missouri School Superintendent Mark Bedell, who claims he can't recall the loss of so many students in one calendar year. The Star editorial asking, where is the outrage over 12 students killed or shot this year? Imagine, the editorial continues, if 12 Shawnee Mission students had been shot this year, would the reaction have been different, Steve?
Yes, it would have been different. And I think just this points to this notion of how numb the community has become to this issue, primarily on the east side. You know, Nick, we've talked about this on this show so many times. We can't solve it. You don't get the sense that the community has come up with new ideas, new approaches, new ways. We've talked here before about the need for this comprehensive, sweeping approach to deal with this. It's about jobs, it's about housing, it's about taking care of the streets on the east side. So many things need to happen to get our arms around this issue that I think we've just sort of lost some steam on this.
We can't solve it, but we can't ignore it either.
That's right.
I mean, when I moved here 20 years ago, I had never seen such a divide like we have in Kansas City. Part of it has to do with the Troost dividing line, but also socially and economically and racially, where you have people out in the suburbs saying, this isn't my problem. It's everyone's problem. And unless we make this a priority in our community and come together and find some solutions, it's not going to get solved.
But it also got a lot more. It got a lot more of attention though this week when you saw violence spilling out just outside the brand new Shake Shack on the Country Club Plaza. At the same time, by the way, New York City just reported its first shooting-free weekend in 2 decades. Is there any explanation for a continual drop in violence in New York City and a relentless uptick in violence in what is supposed to be, Eric, one of the friendliest cities in the country?
But it's a mindset. It's mental health issues. And in spite of everything that Steve has said, we have a mental health issue problem. And like
no question.
Mark said, Halford. I was going to say Halford. But as he said, we don't want to talk about it. We think it's going to take care of itself. We go out, we release some balloons and pray and think the problem is going to be solved.
But New York City doesn't have a mental health issue?
No, well, but what New York City has done
it's a bigger place.
is address the root problems of crime, which is to improve the so-called broken windows theory, where they in essence go into neighborhoods and say, look, if you have good neighborhoods, you will have less violence, and it has worked in some places. It's worked in New York, Washington, other places, Detroit. In Kansas City, the thing we just talked about, the East Side redevelopment, is inexorably linked with the violence problem. You need good schools, good neighborhoods, good streets, good sidewalks, lots of local businesses, entrepreneurship, all of those things. I think at the root, why we pay so much attention to what we do financially on the East Side is this violence problem. Because while all of these other discussions are right, in other cities, this effort to improve the neighborhoods has been the most efficacious in ending violence.
More than 2 years after a 10-year-old boy was decapitated on the world's tallest water slide, the first criminal trial into the tragedy at the Schlitterbahn Water Park in Kansas City, Kansas, got underway this week. And the verdict is in, not guilty. 2 water park maintenance workers acquitted on charges of giving false information to investigators. While some expressed surprise at the speed of the verdict, many of our viewers are astonished that as they drive through Wyandotte County, the water slide is still there, despite a number of reports that the attraction would be dismantled. It hasn't happened. Why?
Good news is it's going to be coming down November 1st, according to reports. You know, this judge on August 28th, I believe, said, hey, it needs to come down. All the evidence has been retained for the future trials. 2 guys were acquitted yesterday in all of this, and now they've started dismantling some portions that you don't see. The main structure will start coming down November 1st.
Those acquittals, though, is just the beginning. There are others, though, who are facing criminal charges in this matter.
No question, but boy, it is time for that water slide to come down, Nick. This has been a stain on the community, and that thing needs to get done pretty soon.
The father, by the way, of Caleb Schwab, the 10-year-old who died in that water park tragedy, is a longtime state lawmaker who is now trying to replace Chris Kobach as Kansas Secretary of State. This week I headed to Topeka to moderate the main debate in that race. What role, if any, should the Secretary of State's office play in immigration policy? That question goes to you first, Scott Schwab.
Mi vendido esperanza por coche en español por 2 años. Mi vendido esperanza por trabajo.
The Secretary of State shouldn't be involved in immigration in any way, shape, or form.
This is not our biggest problem with elections. We need to be protecting the voter database, protecting our voting machines, and protecting the reporting of our results, and that's what really matters.
You can see that debate between Scott Schwab, former Google Vice President Brian McClendon, and the former chair of the Kansas Libertarian Party, Rob Hodgkinson, Sunday evening at 5 here on KCPT. While so much attention is being paid to the race for governor and for Congress this year, are these other down-ballot races that are quite critical being, by and large, ignored, Steve?
You know, they are, Nick. There's so much attention, as you just pointed out, to the U.S. Senate race in Missouri, the governor's race in Kansas. There are some important races here. The Secretary of State's race in Kansas. This is a person who's going to be seen as being the guardian of safe voting in a state like Kansas. In Missouri, you have a race for state auditor. Pivotal office that goes about making sure that state government does what it says it's going to do. Nicole Galloway seeking a full term on her own right there against the Republicans. So, yes, by all means, important races.
We're staying in Kansas for a moment. Did you know that Kansas is one of just 3 states that prohibits transgender residents from changing their birth certificates to correspond with their gender identity? Now the state has been slapped with a lawsuit. The Kansas Department of Health, which administers birth certificates, argues it has no authority to change an individual's birth certificate. So who does, Dave Helling?
I don't know. And I think obviously the Kansas bureaucracy will have to sort of sort this out over time, and the legislature will almost certainly take this up at some level going forward. It is another public relations nightmare that this story has surfaced, Nick, and I do think lawmakers will want to take another look at it.
Mark.
You know, the LGBTQ community really feels strongly that this not only affirms them, but it also gives them an adequate place to go to that reflects their identity. They need some form of identification that will not legitimize, but it will give them the proper identification that they've been seeking.
If this is such a big issue and Kansas is only one of 3 states, why is it that we're not actually hearing candidates talk about this? I don't think I've heard anyone mention this particular issue.
You know, I don't think this issue affects enough people, apparently, Nick, to rise to that level. I think Mark is right, though. I mean, LGBT folks need this information to get driver's licenses or passports. They also want to be full-fledged citizens like the rest of us are, and they want to be able to move forward in their personal lives.
And speaking of voting, actually, this week in Kansas, you can now do face-to-face advanced voting all across the state of Kansas, but not in Johnson County and Wyandotte County. That takes place Monday in Johnson County, Wyandotte County on Tuesday. Right. Why is there a difference?
Because it's left up to the discretion of local election authorities as to when early voting can begin. I think they can mail out ballots starting on the 17th. Early voting is an extraordinarily important option in Kansas. A third to 40–50% of voters cast their ballots before November 6th. We've written repeatedly, Nick, that Missouri needs to get with the program here.
And Missourians just wait for Election Day. This ballot is long, it's complicated. There are issues that voters are going to have to sort through. When those lines are out the door on Election Day in Missouri, there's going to be a huge clamor to get what Kansas already has, which is advanced voting.
But we are told that it's going to be much, much easier this time around. Any problems we've experienced in past primaries have been fixed, and we're going to be ready to go, right, Mark?
That's right. I hope I don't have to wait 2 hours to vote this time like I did in 2016. But we'll see how it goes with the new machines and new systems in place. We're hoping for the best.
I was talking to Lynn Horsley, our Johnson County reporter, yesterday, and suggested that Ronnie Metzger is on his prayer bones this week, hoping that they don't have any reporting problems of the results in Johnson County on November 6th, because, as we know in the primary, it came in the next day. There was great criticism of that. If it happens again, the crescendo will reach its peak.
And a quick kudos to all the people out there who volunteer at these precincts, giving up their time to make sure it goes as smoothly as possible. They don't get the recognition they deserve.
While we began the program talking of big-name politicians parachuting into town, what about top athletes and food stars? The nation's top names in gymnastics will be heading to town as Sprint Center is picked to host the U.S. Gymnastics Championships in August. The U.S. soccer team coming to Children's Mercy Park for 2 international games starting in May. And for foodies, celebrity chef Guy Fieri announces the opening of his newest restaurant, a taco concept that he'll pioneer in the Power and Light District. And for the first time ever, Joe's Kansas City will be open for business on Sunday. But only this Sunday, so the Food Network can show a packed restaurant as they swoop in with their army of cameras. Alrighty, yes, we have a streetcar and we may be getting a new airport, but how, now that we're going to have Guy Fieri coming to town, have we finally made it, Steve Kraske?
I think that's probably a sign that, yeah, we're done trying to worry about progress in Kansas City. We have arrived, Nick.
Is that the pinnacle of achievement in the food scene, Eric?
Absolutely, absolutely. That gets you on the map. All this other stuff is just glitter and glamour, but once you have that happen, then that puts you on the map.
But we have, it's attention in so many different ways. We have all these top political leaders coming to town. We got the news anchors, now celebrity chefs wanting to be right here in our own backyard. And yet we always talk about problems on this program. Some people say, why don't you talk about the good things happening?
The good things.
Isn't this one of these positive examples?
It is. He's good friends. Guy Fieri is good friends with Stretch. who owns Grinders, and I think that's one of the reasons he's seen Kansas City as an attractive market. He's taking a great executive chef from another restaurant. I can't tell you who that is because it's down on the plaza. She's going to be the executive chef, and it's going to be a humdinger of a restaurant.
Can I? You mentioned the airport, and let me throw this in very quickly. There was a report issued today, as we tape this Friday, that Kansas City's economy overall is in healthy shape, largely because of the new airport project. There have been jobs lost, jobs gained, and that Frank Link, I think, was connected with it. But he said because you're building a $1.4 billion airport, the construction jobs and the trickle effect from that will actually keep Kansas City's economy in a fairly healthy shape. The story's at kansascity.com if you haven't seen it. And that's an important thing, good thing to talk about, too. Probably more important, by the way, than Guy Fieri.
So for all of those negative views about the airport, it's now finally paying off even when we haven't even started the construction.
Right. Yeah, and still the taxpayers are not going to pay 1 red cent for
Correct.
it, right?
And that's why he said in his report that it's going to boost the economy because taxpayers aren't paying for it, because airlines are paying for it. That money comes from out of town into Kansas City, doesn't take money out of Kansas City's pockets necessarily, and that's why you get the economic boost that you do.
Are we seeing still problems, though, about building the airport? Is that still an issue, or is that still full speed ahead?
It's moving ahead pretty well. I think there's some bugs they got to work out with the financing of it, the MBE, WBE participation. I think they're close to reaching mutual ground on that. So I think it's been a good process all along.
Just quickly, it's been a year since it was approved by voters, almost a year, November of 2017. I think they understand at Edgemoor and at City Hall, you need to be tossing some dirt into the air by the end of this year, or people are going to get a little frustrated at the slowness of the process.
And that is our Week in Review. Our thanks to our news reviewers from the Fox 4 morning news team, Mark Alford, and from your pages of the Kansas City Star, Dave Helling. Steve Kraske graces the pages of the Star too and lights up the airwaves as the host of Up to Date, weekdays at 11 on our public radio station KCUR-FM, and from the pages of the Call newspaper, Eric Wesson. I'm Nick Haynes. From all of us here at KCPT, thanks for spending part of your weekend with us.